fact, all the wrestling world, all over Georgia, everybody was talking about the Carolinas, and they were on fire. Tell us about Ricky Steamboat, and looked like he had rock star status. Tell us.
Man, I tell you, when Ricky came to town, it was that rock star deal, man. I mean, he was a great looking guy, had a phenomenal physique. All the girls were crazy about him, and we got to see, and Rick will tell you, even to this day, a lot of people herald their '89, trilogy or whatever. Rick will say, you got nothing on what we did back in the 70s. And he's exactly right. And we got to see that. I mean, they headlined many shows in County Hall. In fact, we saw him trade the U.S. title there one time. I mean, that was, now talk about popping a building. That was the big red, the old big red U.S. title with the U.S. symbol
Yes,
right in the
beautiful
middle,
belt.
with
Yes.
the red leather strap, and Rick traded it with Blackjack and Paul Jones, and different ones like that. Paul, of course, was the first one to have it when he beat Terry Funk for it in Greensboro, and or one of the ones up Johnny Valentine. A bunch of them different ones had it, but when Rick got it, that was one of his first steps toward, of course, being the world champion later. But yeah, we saw him in Steamboat several times in County Hall, and man, they stole the show. I mean, there was no following that, because it was Rick at that time wasn't, I would say, not near the showman that he would eventually evolve into being. As far as, I mean, he's had the strut and the woo and everything, but it was nothing. He was very serious back then. When he and Steamboat were together, they were making magic, man. I mean, and the thing about their matches that was so unique is they worked the entire match, whether it was 60 minutes, 30 minutes, or even 90 minutes. There was no rest holds. I mean, they were constantly bumping. I mean, they were going nonstop. Every now and then you'd have a headlock or something, but in general, they worked the entire match, and nobody could follow that. I mean, it was amazing, amazing.
The connection with the fans of that time, I think unbreakable,
Oh,
absolutely
no doubt.
unbreakable, especially with Flair and with Steamboat, and they were killing it. And if you haven't had an opportunity to see, they are some of these matches on YouTube.
They are.
Check it out,
It
ladies
is.
and gentlemen. If you don't believe that Ricky Steamboat was a rock star, and you think that it
No,
only happened later, no,
no, no, no.
Steamboat was
No.
huge.
When Ricky first came in, I guess they had made a deal. George Scott had made a deal with Eddie Graham, and got him up to the Carolinas. And of course, he wasn't Ricky Steamboat. They were going to call him, well, they were initially going to call him Richard Blood, his real name.
Yes.
But Tito Santana was actually already working under that name.
Yes.
So Sam Steamboat, who was Tim Woods' partner back in the '60s, they looked a lot alike. So he became Ricky Steamboat. And but when he and Rick, I tell you, when they did the angle, when they scrubbed his face on the floor, and they messed up his face. Of course, this great looking guy, and Rick's walking around with the poster, with his man. I'm telling you, everywhere they went was sold out, because everybody wanted to see him. And he tells the story about how in the dressing room, Gene Anderson, they really did do that. They took sandpaper, and it was
They
real.
sure did.
That
Towel.
wasn't makeup.
Rub that towel in the face. Wow. All right. So the next part, we heard about it. We didn't get to really see it. Paul Jones' turn on Ricky Steamboat. How was that?
Well, Paul, to his dying day, said Ricky Steamboat turned on him. But I love talking to Paul. He was so funny. I mean, I don't know if you ever got to meet him, but Paul was one of the funniest guys. Oh my goodness, he was hilarious. But I tell you though, Paul and Ricky were such a phenomenal team. Mid Atlantic Tag Team Champions, World Tag Team. They had such a great tag, and that was one of the, for me, looking back, remembering one of the first heel turns I remember. And it was one of those that you couldn't believe. This can't be happening. These two guys were the most popular tag team in the territory. Everybody loved Paul and Ricky, and how could Paul do this? And, of course, because the magic of our time was what Paul had done and been heel in Florida. Nobody up there ever knew that. No, I never knew that until I got older. I didn't see that stuff because we didn't have access to it. There was no cable TV, and we had, like I said earlier, antenna, and you had to turn it the right way to get three channels. And so we didn't know that Paul had been a heel before in Florida. We didn't know any of the Mr. Florida gimmick or none of that stuff. He was just Paul Jones. He teamed with Nelson Royal back in the 60s. He teamed with Wahoo. And then when he was teaming with Steamboat. Now, the funny thing Paul would tell you is that all the promoters, the Crockett's and Eddie Graham and everybody that he ended up tagging with, they needed a rub, so that's why they would put Paul. It's funny. There's a funny story. He's got this picture of him and Wahoo, and he's like, "Yeah, Crockett asked me to go there and take that picture so Wahoo could get a little rub." And it's like, Paul, come on, man. But he was such a funny guy. But yeah, I remember that like it was yesterday, right after the Battle Royal, and Paul turned, and the place went nuts. They couldn't believe it. And the heat that he drew was unbelievable. And what was great about Paul, though, is once he turned heel, he went all in. I mean, the speeches. But Paul, even if he didn't mean to, was comedy gold. I loved hearing his promos. Let me tell you something. It was just, and the stuff that he did with Rufus and the Baron, and it's just magic, man. Loved it.
Well, a lot of people didn't realize that Paul Jones was a wrestler. They only think of it and he actually stated in one of his, we reviewed World Championship Wrestling. He actually stated, you remember, because it was Jimmy Valiant wanted to wrestle him. He said, you have to understand, I'm a former United States champion. I'm a former World Tag Team champion. I mean, and maybe they should have packaged that, but maybe not. But he was a huge draw everywhere he went. Georgia.
Paul started in Texas, back in the, late 50s, early 60s, and he was a big star everywhere that he went. He was a big deal here in Florida with Buddy Colt. Man, they had a gigantic angle down here, and of course all over the Carolinas with Nelson and Wahoo and all those stuff. And it really is a shame. And I would say that about Paul and even guys like Wahoo and Valentine and different ones, that they don't get the recognition that they really should get, because a lot of, like you're right, a lot of modern day fans, and it really kind of burns me up sometimes when I see some of the comments on some of these, commentary sites, or, they're about, old Paul was terrible manager. You don't know. You just didn't see the magic that this guy did back when he was on top of his game. Man, the angle that he and Blackjack worked over the U.S. title was phenomenal, because it was the David and Goliath deal. I mean, Paul was a little guy, Blackjack's 6'9", and then Paul went over. The place went crazy. I mean, it was great.
He was one of the few that I could see actually work into an Indian deathlock and make it look easy. That is not an easy hole to get in.
No, it is not. It is not. And Paul told such funny stories about how some of those things came about. And a lot of it I don't want to tell on air, because it probably would not be politically correct. But to sit in the room with him and hear, it was absolute hilarious. But some of the stuff, in fact, I was talking to Dick Bourne this afternoon from Mid-Atlantic Gateway, and we were reminiscing over some of the stuff that Paul did, and with Baron von Raschke. And I'm telling you, man, it was just absolutely hilarious. But at the same time, Paul was a phenomenal worker in the ring. I mean, the matches with he and Jack Briscoe, even later, back in the late 70s, early 80s, over the Mid-Atlantic title stuff, they were just fantastic stuff, and I loved it.
Wow. I knew he came to Georgia. That was the first time I think we got introduced to him. It was in 77.
Yeah.
And the first time he was on TV, it was for the Georgia heavyweight title on television. Yeah. It was Dick Slater against Paul Jones. Paul Jones beat him in the middle of the ring. And best, probably about 6 weeks, he was the Georgia heavyweight champion. Then he loses it on television. I'll never forget it. Yep. Dick Slater brings in Bearcat Wright as his manager. Right. Yep. You remember him?
Oh, and,
both were knocked out, and Bearcat Wright threw hot coffee into Slater's face to revive him, and Slater wins the belt back. I'll never forget that.
Yeah, Bearcat. They did an angle here in the Carolinas with Bearcat where they tore his clothes off and embarrassed him. And then he was, I think Ole was involved in that somewhere along the way. I know, going back to Paul, Ole and Gene had a lot of great matches with Paul and Steamboat when they were tag team, just great. But Bearcat brought in Sonny King. And that's how a lot of those guys they had introduced into the deal. And then of course, it was, they didn't bring in a lot of the black guys that back then. It was usually specific ones that came in. You guys had Thunderbolt and different ones and stuff. They would pass through. Our staple guys were like Rufus and some of the different ones like that, but Bearcat and Sonny King, they all came through. So it was, man, Bo Brazil, all those guys. It was just man, I tell you, we could talk about it forever because because it was such a unique part of our growing up. And whether we're like you guys, where you were really, really close to the business through your dad, but even for mine as a kid, from a fan's perspective, it was just part of what you did. I mean, it was as natural to me as it was for other people who were hooked on football. Sure. As a young person, I could have cared less about football. I wanted to see real sports. I wanted to watch professional wrestling. It was just a different world.
Now that you mentioned that, I'm going to get back to that in just a second about the talk and the correlation that you have between wrestling and other sports. But real quick, I don't think anybody understands the importance of Rip Hawk and Sweet Hansen as a tag team.
Man. Those guys were awesome.
And that was, when were they primarily the team in the Mid-Atlantic?
Pretty much all throughout the 60s. I mean, they were the guys, no doubt about it. And then early 70s, they had a little bit more, and they broke them up for a while, turned them against one another. But they, in their time, though, I mean, the stuff that they worked, I mean, back in the day against George and Sandy Scott, and they were the number one heel team, period. I mean, they were the guys, and they really, really drew the heat too. Because Rip was the talker. Because he was, the blonde, he had the blonde, the arrogant, and he was a natural heel. And of course, a lot of people that just aren't versed in history, they read some things, but Rip was actually the first guy they put Rick with when he first came in, and as some type of relative or some such a thing, some kind of gimmick like that, but to get him off. And later on, Rip was telling me this story when we were together. He said, man, when they first brought that boy in, I just thought, well, if we can keep his pants on, maybe he'll finally be somebody. Because Rick was notorious for being naked for some reason.
Had a problem with clothes.
I understand he might still, but a 72-year-old Nature Boy is not the same as a 21-year-old Nature Boy.
No, and Rip Hawk and Ric Flair were actually partners, or is that right?
They were Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Champions. They sure were.
Sure. We grew up, as we were growing up, the regional title, of course, we were in Georgia. Dad was there for 12 years, I think it was. To us, the Georgia Heavyweight Championship, and I know this sounds strange to some people, but was actually more important than the world title.
Oh, by all means.
Did you, in your area, what title to you was the title?
The Mid-Atlantic belt, absolutely. No, the Mid-Atlantic champion was the guy you got to see all the time. The world champion, of course, back in that day was, Dory Funk, Jack Briscoe, and Harley Race. And so it wasn't until Rick really got into the runs that you ever really saw the world champion. I mean, the world champion was like a specialty, a very, very special thing. I mean, even in the big matches, we go to, I remember I saw Harley a couple of times when he was world champion. I saw Jack one time and Dory, I think, one time when they were actual. I saw them many times, but when they were actual champion. But that was they were really traveling world champions, and they worked all the territories for the NWA. And so our guy was the Mid-Atlantic champion. And then the second tier after that was the U.S. champion, because again,
it's strange. The Mid-Atlantic and then the U.S. title.
Then the U.S. That's right.
Wow,
that's right. Because the Mid-Atlantic champion was like the representative of our South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Virginia, whatever. He was, and obviously they didn't go to all those places as the champ sometimes, but that big, and they had a big belt. It was kind of, I wouldn't say similar to the Mid-South belt, that gigantic belt that Bill Watts had made. But it was so unique because you had the big center plate with the Mid-Atlantic region in it, and then each side plate was a
It was
different state.
white, right?
It was white in the
White.
middle,
That's
and
right.
then each side plate was like there was a South Carolina, a North Carolina, Virginia, and it was just to me a beautiful belt. And of course Wahoo had it, and Rick had it, and Rip Hawk and Jerry Briscoe kind of first started off. There was the Eastern heavyweight champion, and it evolved into the Mid-Atlantic heavyweight champion. Danny Miller, I think, was one of the first ones that actually had it. And Rip Hawk had it, and then later, of course, Paul Jones had it. And then ultimately, the last guy to have it was Ronnie Garvin, but multiple guys up through the '80s, they started trading it around and didn't have near the value. But back in the day, in the early '70s, yeah, man, the Mid-Atlantic champion, he was a big deal.
And which champion stood out the most when you think of the Mid-Atlantic champion? Who is it that you said, okay, that's his belt?
I would say back then, for me, it was two guys that when they wore that belt that you just knew, and it was Wahoo and Greg Valentine. And they had a phenomenal war over that back and forth. I mean, other guys had it, even Rick and stuff, but Wahoo and Greg really stood out because they just their feud over that belt. And of course, that was where the famous gimmick was, where Valentine wore the shirt, "I broke Wahoo's leg," and all that stuff. That was all over the Mid-Atlantic title. And there was something special about them trading that belt back and forth, because when Greg had it, you really, really wanted to see Wahoo get it back. And they really knew how to do it, man.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, you mentioned Greg Valentine. Let's talk about his father, Johnny Valentine, who I felt should have been world champion.
Absolutely.
Tell us about Johnny. We didn't get a chance to see him. It was by the time we started going to wrestling, I think he pretty much was out of it at that time. Tell us about Johnny Valentine.
Johnny was one of those guys. He was a very unique heel. He didn't talk a lot. His promos were, excuse me, were pretty low key. He never hollered. He wasn't the hollering kind of guy that later would become a heel. He just really said what he was going to do. Kind of like Bill Eadie. Bill Eadie, if you talk to Bill says the way he learned, and I'm sure that he came from that same mindset, as the heel, to be a credible heel, you said what you were going to do and you went out and did it. If you said, "I'm going to go and smash this guy," the intent was that's exactly what you're going to go do. And so Valentine was much that way. And where it took Johnny a while to get over, as far as, really build that credible fan base that really couldn't stand him. But Johnny was one of the first guys that I ever saw that could stand on the ring apron and not say a word and draw heat. And he could stand in the ring, and if he would hold a headlock, for a couple of minutes, and if people didn't make enough noise or didn't boo it, he would stand there longer. He would make them hate him. I mean, that was it. His full intention was to leave there that nobody liked him, and he was a very unique guy. But another one though, that really, it was who he was. It was, you didn't see him as anybody else. And later in life, when I got to know him personally, he was still Johnny Valentine, even though, he was, of course, couldn't really get around and had this plane crash deal and stuff. But he was the real thing. And and everybody that worked him, they knew he was about as stiff as it was going to get. I mean, and his famous quote, and a lot of people have used it. It's on some banners and different stuff. He said, "I can't make you believe in wrestling, but I can sure make you believe in me." And he meant that.
Dad, my father would say that Johnny was not a person that if you expect a quick match out of him, you're not. No. It's not something that he does. He's got to. If he's on the card, he's got to have 60 minutes.
Absolutely.
He said, because I don't get warmed up to the 30-minute mark.
That's right. No, that's true. He didn't do the 10-minute time limit deal. That was not him. I mean, he was going to be on top, and he was, and most likely when I saw him in my time, it was against Wahoo. They had the biggest feud. They had brought that out of Texas, and because they had done it there, and they brought it to the Carolinas. And of course, again, the benefit of our territory time was nobody knew that, because nobody, and so nobody had any idea that they had done that many, many times. But when Valentine came in, he wanted Wahoo because he knew they could have believable matches. And of course, back then that was the product, is they wanted people to believe it. And those two did it probably as well as anybody. And but you're right, it was very slow. There was no high spots. There wasn't any fancy. It was sledgehammer blows and body slams and hard elbows. And yeah,
And
it was the real deal, man.
the matches that I saw with Johnny, he sold most of the match.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially to the end. And he looked like by the end of that match that they would need the stretcher to stretcher him out.
Oh, by all means. And Johnny, though, Johnny, again, if you go back and find some of the old magazines and stuff, Johnny was a star up north.
Sure.
He was everywhere. And if you look back, there's some latter right before the end of his time and after the plane crash and stuff. There's some phenomenal matches from him in Florida with Paul Jones. I mean, they tore the house down. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah, really, and I really think he should probably have been the world champion because
Absolutely.
he was just
Absolutely.
that good. Tell us about.
I know, like in the last few years, and again, I understand it's their place; they can do whatever they want. But with the WWE Hall of Fame, they have the legacy classes, and they put in secondarily kind of the guys that I feel like were the pioneers, like Johnny and Wahoo and some of those guys. They get 2 seconds of recognition with their picture on the screen, but of course, I mean, obviously they're gone. They can't give speeches or what have you, but they don't get the recognition that they should get, because I know some of them get, like Paul, different ones get seen as regional stars, but man, those guys drew some big crowds and they had a lot of fans. They really did.
Sure. Yeah, it burns me up when I hear people tell me that wrestling's bigger today. I mean,